Ros, we've talked a bit about expression and communication as this plays out for intermediate students or advanced students. What about in a beginner's class? The Silent Way is known for using rods and charts. It's known as a beginner's approach to language learning. Could you say a bit about how a Silent Way class for beginners sets off and how you see the expression communication dichotomy playing out there?
Yes. I think when Gattegno invented the Silent Way, the industry that we have now didn't exist. And so his first book was called Teaching Foreign Languages in Schools, because that's where you learnt foreign languages. Right. And people were beginners. And now, within the industry, most people coming to classes are no longer beginners, because they're beginners in schools, but schools are tied down to programs. Gattegno invented computer programs for mathematics, which he called visible and tangible maths. Right. And I think we could call this visible and tangible language. That's to say, what the rods do is make it absolutely clear what is going on. We're talking about rods. If this is what's being used, then we're talking about a blue rod. If this is what's being shown, then we're talking about two blue rods, etc., etc. Everybody knows what is being talked about. This is not always the case. Even in a book which is very well illustrated, it's not always the case, because an illustration can't show exactly what is being illustrated.
People's attention in the same way.
In the same way, exactly. And so what happens in a Silent Way class for beginners is that people describe, it's visual, you can see the rods, and it's tangible, you can hold the rods, you can say to somebody, how many rods have you got in your hand? And there is an answer, which is 3. Right? And this is what is necessary so that people know what is actually being talked about. It should be added too that what Gattegno was trying to get to was not really the vocabulary of the language. What he was trying to get to was that people had a real sense of what it is to speak English or French or Japanese or Chinese, how these people think. Right? A language is there for people to interact with other people, for people to be in contact with the space around them and describe what's going on in the space around them and in the time that they're living in. And this is what a language does. And then, of course, there's all sorts of vocabulary. You need words for flowers and you need words for lawns. Actually, it's not all that clear that people will be talking about flowers and lawns. I remember teaching a French class to 20 Bulgarian engineers, and they were going to be spread through a factory, each one on a different post. And we did no vocabulary. What we did do was say to the people who actually bought the course, in 2 months' time, put them on their post now, and in 2 months' time they will be functional. Because what we had given them was a sense of how French works, a sense of the system. They knew the pronouns very well, because this is something that people find hard to learn. And they knew the verb tenses, and what they needed was the vocabulary, but they all needed different vocabulary. And so this course took place over 105 hours, after which they were placed into their positions in the factory. And 2 months later, they were operational. This is what would happen in a beginner's course.
So they learned the vocabulary on the job. The vocabulary, which is what they weren't going to learn on the job, was how French worked. They weren't going to learn the spirit of the French on the job.
Yes.
So that's what you did in the classroom.
Yes.
And then the stuff which they could best learn in vivid interactions where they actually needed the word or somebody was describing something to them, that part of the story they did there.
Exactly, yes. If I ask the question, for example, I've done this many times, what do you think you should be teaching? People who in the communicative approach will say to me, well, greetings, and they will say what's in the first book.
Transactional sort of stuff.
Exactly, yes. And I would say to them, we're starting from a completely different point of view. We're starting from the point of view that what should you be teaching? You should be teaching those things that the students will find extremely difficult if they have to do it by themselves. For example, in French, the pronouns, there are hundreds of them. Well, hundreds, that's an exaggeration, but there are lots and lots of pronouns. The verb tenses, people don't know how these work. So what I want to teach my students is, first of all, to hear French correctly, to be able to pronounce French correctly, and to have a sense of how the language functions in human relations and in respect to time and to space. The vocabulary will be easy to put in. Once you're in a situation where you need vocabulary, you can ask. And the vocabulary fits into the language very, very well. But you must be able to hear the language well, and you must be able to produce the language well.
And say again, I mean, how do the rods fit into this? Why is it useful to use rods in a beginner's class?
Simply because the rods, how you deal with the rods, allows you to deal with these aspects of the language. For example, if I'm going to say, my rod's blue, and I give you one, and I give you this one, for example, so you're going to say, your rod's, what you're going to say is, my rod's yellow. What I'm going to say of yours is, your rod's yellow. And mine's blue, and we're into the pronouns straight away. And we've been doing this now for, 3 hours of pronunciation and perhaps another 5 hours, so that we're straight into adjectives of possession, pronouns, possessive pronouns. We're into, we would never do the conjugation, for example. I am, you are, he is, we are. What we would do is always use a situation. Why would I say you to you? Because I'm looking at you, and this is what happens when people say you. They're looking at the person. If I'm talking about this person over here, I'd refer to him as he, right? But I'm looking at you. And this is what people have to get right inside. They have to incorporate right into themselves the real way you use pronouns, which is you speak of him because he's over here. You speak of you. I speak of I here. Right? And this is how we use pronouns. We use pronouns with visual clues. Right? And this is what seems to me important. And we use verb tenses when we're actually doing things.
It seems to me, when I've been a learner in a Silent Way class, one of the things which is wonderful about it is that the rods create completely unambiguous linguistic situations.
Exactly.
Everybody in the class understands what's going on and what's then needed. If going back to this expression versus communication issue, everybody can see the situation, everybody understands the situation. Now, what are the words we need to actually express that situation in the new language which we're learning?
Exactly. Yes.
And the amount of vocabulary is the word, whatever the word is for rod in the language you're learning, 10 colour names,
yes.
and thereafter all the vocabulary which you're learning are the functional words of the language, which language express the relationships you've described in space, between people, in time, etc., etc.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yes. And that in fact is what you do in a beginner's class. Very, very quickly it's possible to describe all sorts of things. For example, you can describe positions very easily. The red rod is on the green one, which is on the red one, or the red one is under the green one, which is whatever. But it's also possible to stand people up in the class and have somebody be in front of somebody and behind somebody else, to the right of somebody, to the left of somebody, etc., so that it quickly becomes more personal. But the rods give you a start into the way the language functions. And this is really very important. For a language like Japanese or Chinese, there's a completely different way of looking at the world.
And of course, when they come to English, the opposite way around.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what they have to get is the sense of how English-speaking people do this.
Yes. And time in class is best used doing that and not learning all the vocabulary for them going to a hotel or catching a taxi or whatever else it is that's being taught in a more transactional type way.
Absolutely, because this is what gets you to the heart of the language. This is what makes English different from French or Japanese.
Yeah.
It's not the vocabulary, of course the vocabulary, but it's not the vocabulary. What makes it really different, what makes it a foreign language, this is what's foreign in a foreign language. It's the way you look at the world. A completely different way.
How do students react to being in a Silent Way class, either as beginners? The sort of activities you're describing is not what they're coming to expect. They have an expectation for a language class, and it isn't talking about rods on a table, and it isn't probably having a conversation among themselves and having a teacher as a sort of shadowy figure who's not actually telling them what to do. How do students react to these situations?
Sometimes they're quite surprised at the beginning, but they very quickly take to it because there's no judgment. What they're doing is just simply trying things out. Once they get the hang of what they have to do, that takes them time, in fact. What they have to do is realize that they are responsible for their learning. Right. I can't learn for them. All I can do is smooth the path. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think of it in terms of curling, you know, the sport curling, where somebody is sweeping.
In front of whatever it's called, the kettle or the iron or whatever it's called, is the stone, I think it's called, is sent spinning off, yes.
That's right. Well, my job, I'm a sweeper, right? Okay. And my students are the stones. And what I have to do is get them on target, straight there as fast as possible. Right. So, and I just sweep ahead of them, if you like, so that they waste no time, so that the learning process is facilitated. This is subordination of teaching to learning.